Good afternoon, everyone. Hello from AACC in Washington, D.C. This is David Boehm, Senior Vice President for Government Relations here at the association. I'm joined this afternoon by my colleagues Jim Hermes, Associate Vice President for Government Relations, and Catherine Gimboris, who is our Government Relations Manager. This afternoon, we're going to focus primarily on what's going on in the Congress at this time. We know that many of you are very focused on and interested in, for all the right reasons, in actions that the Trump administration has taken since it took the administration on January 20th. We know we've seen executive orders, dear colleague letters, momentary funding freeze, some issues related to personnel in the Department of Education, and all these things we're watching very carefully. But the major thrust of this afternoon's webinar, and thanks everyone for joining us, is going to be on the work that we continue to do in Congress and that we ask for your help in helping us achieve our legislative agenda. So the agenda this afternoon is on the following topics. Jim, please. Yes, so these are the things that we're going to get into. Before I turn things over to Jim to talk about where we are in the funding process, just a few notes. First of all, we will make the PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar available as we typically do. So there you will be able to access this afterwards. No need necessarily to take copious notes on things. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is that you can also post questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave some time at the conclusion of the presentation for your questions. So if anything occurs to you along the way, you can put it in there and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And then if we can't get to all of them in the allotted time, we will do our best to respond to them as follow-up to you tomorrow, if not today. So with that, by way of introduction, thanks again, everybody, for being with us. And Jim, take it away on fiscal year 2025 appropriations. How are we going to do?
Well, who knows? We're gonna do our best is what we're gonna do. Thanks, David. Yeah, so I think most of you are aware that right now we're actually just a little over 2 weeks away from the next D-Day, so to speak, and that is March 14th. That is the date at which the current, what's called a continuing resolution that is keeping the government open and operating under last year's funding levels. That's the date that resolution expires. So Congress must do something by that March 14th date to keep the government operating, either pass final funding legislation for the rest of the fiscal year, or more likely pass another continuing resolution that gives them a little bit more time to negotiate out that final funding legislation and get it written and passed. You can see here that unless this is a process, unlike the one that we'll talk about in a few minutes, this is a process that's a normal legislative process, and therefore needs Democratic support to pass in the Senate, and really also realistically speaking, also in the House, because of the razor-thin margin that Republicans have there. The parties, even though we're just a little over 2 weeks away, the Republicans and Democrats have not yet agreed on top-line numbers for defense and non-defense programs. So that is step one, really, in terms of the process, is deciding on those overall numbers, and only after that point can individual bills be written that adhere to those numbers. Reports are that we are reading and hearing from conversations with Hill staff that they are close to agreeing on those numbers. But one issue that apparently is still a sticking point is that because of everything that's been happening in the last few weeks in terms of spending or not spending money that has been appropriated, that the Democrats want assurance of some sort in the funding bill that the funds will be spent as intended by the Trump administration. And that is, from what we're hearing, that has proven to be a sticking point in these negotiations. So more to come on that. We will hopefully see that agreement in the next, a couple of days, ideally, And again, even if they come up with an agreement that soon, they will most likely have to do another short-term continuing resolution to keep the government open for a little while longer while they hash out all the details. There has been talk, as there often is, about the remainder of the fiscal year being funded just by another continuing resolution, as opposed to one or more larger bills that are closer, that more closely resemble your typical appropriations bill. Uh, that is, I think it's safe to say that that is becoming less likely of an outcome, particularly because of these reports that we're hearing about the parties being close on funding levels. But we'll have to see. And if that should happen, there are question marks because actually we rarely, if ever, have done a full year CR. So some of the questions that come up under that are whether a continuing resolution counts for for funding bills for purposes of funding caps. And I won't go into all that, but just suffice it to say it could make a difference in terms of overall funding levels under the last Budget Act, whether it is a continuing resolution that funds the government for the rest of the fiscal year or a full appropriations bill. And then the other question mark would be, well, there are a number of them, but the other one I'll mention is what would become of congressionally directed spending or earmarks. A number of you out there, I'm sure, possibly have earmarks that were included in this either in the Senate bill or the House bills that were done last year, and are very much eager to know whether those projects will remain in the funding list in the final funding legislation for the rest of the year. Most likely, although it's not certain, if in fact the rest of the year was done through a continuing resolution, it's probably the likeliest outcome that that would not include those congressionally directed spending, but that's certainly far from certain. So another thing that we'll be looking and monitoring as as this situation unfolds. So one of the biggest things that we're dealing with now, in terms of appropriations and also reconciliation, which David will talk about in a minute, is the fact that the Pell Grant program, which for several years up until now has been in a surplus situation, and in fact that is the mechanism by which we've achieved all the funding increases for all the maximum grant increases over the last several years, has been because of that funding surplus. Now the CBO is projecting a shortfall of $2.7 billion in the current fiscal year in that program. And that's basically because, you may recall that in their last projection, the CBO actually was not projecting a shortfall until 2029. What has changed, you might ask? Well, basically what has changed is that the CBO took a very aggressive view in terms of how many fewer students there might be enrolled in college in the coming year, in this year, because of the FAFSA debacle that we had for the current academic year. That turned out not to be nearly as bad as at least the CBO was projecting. So we have a lot more students and a lot more people receiving Pell Grants than they had projected. And therefore, what they had were previously projecting as a continued surplus for this year is now a $2.7 billion shortfall. And as you can see there, that's just the beginning. Is actually a projected shortfall of $98 billion over the next 10 years if no changes are made in the program funding level. Congress, in order to pass the FY25 bills in this spring sometime, doesn't actually have to worry about that. They are not beholden to this particular score quite yet, but they would have to deal with this situation by the time that the next fiscal year starts on September 30th. And as we'll talk about in a second, as David will talk about, the reconciliation bill is the best opportunity for getting the large amounts of cash that we need infused in that program to take care of the shortfall. It's just not really feasible to inject billions and billions of dollars into the program to address the shortfall through the discretionary appropriations process. Anyway, we will continue. We are advocating for our priorities. We'll continue to do so and call on you out there to continue advocating for our funding priorities for the year. You can see some of our top ones there. We have a much wider list of programs and other things that we advocate for in terms of funding levels. really just kind of generally speaking, a good outcome for most programs in this coming in the for the rest of the fiscal year will be level funding. We may see cuts here and there and possibly some increases. As you can see, one of the places that we're advocating for an increase is actually in the Pell Grant program, and that's for a $200 increase in the maximum grant to keep pace with inflation. That is definitely complicated by this new CBO score that I was just talking about. And then these other ones are really kind of, the next two are really kind of on our list perennially because community colleges are really the only ones out there advocating for these programs, the SEC TG program, Strengthening Community College Training Grants, and the Title III-A Strengthening Institutions programs. We're really the main constituent, we're the only constituent of one, and the main one of the other, the Title III-A grants. So we want to make sure that people are hearing about those programs, and if they're not hearing from us as a community, they're really not going to hear about them at all up on the Hill. And then, of course, these are just a few examples of the other things that are on our list. And as I said a minute ago, level funding is probably going to be a good outcome for most programs in this funding cycle. And then just a few words about FY26. As is typical for a year in which there's a change of administration, we will see the new administration's budget at a later time than is typical, which is the first Monday in February for the release of the administration's budget. That a new administration just coming in can't really abide by that deadline. So we're expecting to see a budget in March, just based on, well, both the first Trump administration and, of course, everything that we've seen and the focus on cutting government spending that we've seen so far in this administration, we are expecting to see very deep cuts to domestic programs in the Trump administration's budget. It is very much worth recalling that that was the case in the first Trump administration as well. And while you should only go so far in terms of drawing parallels between that first administration and this one. And of course, it's a bit of a different Congress in terms of makeup. But remember, back to the first slide, we still do need Democratic support to get funding bills through, as long as the filibuster is still in place. So while we may start with a budget that has very deep funding cuts, what we experienced in the first Trump administration was that Congress pretty much rejected those cuts. And, we actually had some years of decent funding increases in our programs. That is not by any stretch a projection of what might happen in the next few years under this Trump administration. But that is just one, sort of data point to go by in terms of what we might expect to happen. The FY26 will be a year that is not at this point under budget caps. So currently we are operating under budget caps that were put together in the Fiscal Responsibility Act a couple of years ago. That was just for FY24 and 25. However, it would not be at all surprising to see a new piece of legislation that might also deal with the debt limit, and that issue is coming up pretty soon. A lot of other times Congress has dealt with both those issues, both debt limit and the trade-off being caps on spending that greases the wheel for getting the debt limit through. So we might see something like that happen again and have new budget caps to live with. But in the meantime, what you should be continuing to do as community college leaders and advocates is to continue to let your legislators know, particularly those new ones that are just starting out, but also any and other existing congressional members, to keep educating them about the programs that you rely on and why they matter and the impact that they're having on both on your institution and even probably more importantly on the community at large. As long as we continue to bring that message forth, hopefully we can achieve some pretty good outcomes. I'm going to turn it back over to David now to talk about the all-important budget reconciliation legislation.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the process of budget reconciliation and then get a little bit further into the priorities the AACC has within this context. The first thing to understand about budget reconciliation is that it's kind of the spoils that goes to the victor of a election trifecta, that it is an activity that is undertaken when one party controls both houses of Congress and the White House. And that is not a common occurrence. The reconciliation process has been used by a new president a number of times to make some dramatic changes to federal policy. One of the ones that many people will remember is the Affordable Care Act, which was passed in 2010 under President Obama and a Democratic Congress. In 2017, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was passed under President Trump in his first administration. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then more recently, in 2021, the American Rescue Plan was passed with the congressional Democratic votes only, and it was signed into law by President Biden. But what's unique about reconciliation is that it only takes 51 votes in the Senate to clear that legislation, whereas normally the filibuster requires that party have or legislation have 60 votes in order to get through the Senate. So it's a very different dynamic. And then another thing that is unique to reconciliation is that it only applies to what are known as mandatory programs. And these mandatory programs are essentially separate from the annually appropriated programs that we work on year in and year out. So when you hear about a budget deal and about appropriations and about funding deadlines and continuing resolutions, all that is generally speaking about appropriations. That's the process that funds Pell Grants, with some exceptions, TRIO, Gear Up, WIOA, Perkins, NSF programs, agriculture programs, economic development. All of those programs are essentially off the table in reconciliation. Reconciliation only applies to programs that have mandatory funding, which is funding that occurs year in and year out, absent legislative changes. So it's an important vehicle that a majority, as I just described, is able to use to make changes to programs that it would not otherwise be able to make under most political circumstances. So as this first slide outlines, some of the things that the Republican majority in the Congress working with the president are looking to do with this reconciliation process, in which, again, no Democratic votes are required, include tax cuts. They want to extend the tax cuts that I mentioned a minute ago that were enacted in 2017. They want to make some new tax cuts. There is a strong emphasis, as you all know, in immigration enforcement by the administration, as well as increasing the defense spending. There is a desire to repeal some of the tax incentives that were given for so-called clean energy that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act. That was passed also just with Democratic votes under reconciliation rules and under former President Biden. As this slide, the last bullet in this slide is one that I started with, and that is essentially what makes reconciliation different. Only needs 51 Senate votes and only applies to mandatory programs. So the regular grinding year in, year out funding battles that we go through appropriations with the fiscal year that starts on October 1, runs through September 30th, has lots of pauses in it at various times, and a lot of dramatics, is different under reconciliation. Next slide, please, Jim. So we don't need to spend much time going over this next slide, but it does highlight the fact that the House and the Senate have embarked upon different approaches to securing passage of the legislation. President Trump initially favored and has generally supported what the House just did quite dramatically last night with voting to approve the budget resolution by just one vote. And that is to do a single reconciliation bill that would include all the broad policy objectives, and they're extraordinarily ambitious, that President Trump and congressional Republicans have outlined. The Senate, however, had and has now earlier passed resolution that would envision two reconciliation bills. And the dynamics there are as outlined in this slide. The Senate Republicans, Majority Leader Thune, was of the mind that if we move one bill first, it'll be easier for us to get this done quicker. We can give a win to President Trump, as it were, on some of his top priorities. There's a great desire to increase defense spending quickly, money for immigration enforcement, as I mentioned a moment ago. With the House's action last night, however, the members of the House and the Senate, Republican leadership, and other principals, budget committee members and others are going to have to conference or compromise on an approach to budget policy, because it takes agreement on the House and Senate on a budget resolution in order to unlock the reconciliation process that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in just a second. There's been a lot of talk that with the House having done essentially the president's bidding, or at least act in accordance with his priority, that the Senate would be under a lot of pressure to adopt the House budget resolution. But we've already heard since the resolution was passed late last night that the Senate is still not bought into the House approach, and you'll no doubt be reading and hearing a lot about back and forth on that in the coming weeks before some kind of a House-Senate agreement is reached. Next slide, please. So what does it mean for higher education? The House and the Senate budget resolutions included what are known as instructions to their committees. The Senate limited its instruction to just the Help Committee. The House used both the Help and the Ed Workforce committees, but the resolutions have very different approaches to how to reduce spending. And I should have mentioned, but it's important to keep in mind that the general thrust of reconciliation for many members of the Republican Party, in addition to extending tax cuts, which cost money in Washington and in budget-keeping parlance, there are many Republicans who are interested in cutting spending and getting the deficit under control and using this reconciliation process to do that. So as part of that, and in that spirit, the education committees that we work intimately with day in and day out are going to be asked to reduce spending for programs under their jurisdiction. And this slide lays out the very different approaches taken by the House and the Senate on what they're going to ask their committees to do. The way the process works, just to get into it a little bit more deeply, is that if these congressional committees, health, education, labor, and pensions in the Senate, Ed Workforce in the House, if they don't meet the targets that they're assigned under the resolution, the budget committees then have the authority to go ahead and make cuts along the lines that the committees were told to come up with. That's an outcome that any committee chairman wants to avoid at all costs. So as we look at the amounts of spending that these committees are now being charged with reducing, at least under the House and Senate resolutions, you can see how different they are. There will be a compromise number that will be agreed to. We don't know what it is. We won't have much input into what it is. We just know that there will be, in all likelihood, significant spending reductions for education programs that will be part of this process. You can see at the bottom of the slide, these four smaller bullets are all things that we think are going to be on the table. You're all aware of the controversy over President Biden's loan repayment policies, the SAVE plan, loan cancellation and whatnot, the authority that he had. That is something that will be looked at in efforts to try to bring that back into the extent that it hasn't been already by courts. There will be restrictions and limitations on and just less advantageous terms for borrowers under a likely reconciliation outcome. Public service loan forgiveness, Republicans have not been very supportive of that program. Won't go into that. The Grad Plus program doesn't directly impact community colleges, but if budget savings are found through limitations in that program, it will be part of the savings that the committees have to come up with. And then the last one that is of tremendous interest to us, we've talked about it before, and I'll talk about on the next slide in a little bit more detail, is risk sharing. Next slide, please, Jim. Okay, so this is really the most important thing for you to keep focused on within the context of the budget reconciliation process that I just talked about for a few minutes. And that is, what is AACC doing, trying to do for our students, for our institutions in this process, which, as I described, is one in which the basic dynamic is to cut education spending. That's what the committee's charge is going to be. Even given that, we do believe that there are realistic opportunities for us to achieve some of our objectives, to spend more money and stop some bad things from happening, even within this overall effort to cut back spending. So Jim just talked a little bit about the Pell Grant program. The good news for Pell Grants is that more students are getting grants, and a lot of them are getting larger grants than under than before the Simplification Act was put into place. The bad news is that it's created a major funding shortfall projected for the program. Republicans, Democrats, nobody wants there to be cuts in Pell Grants, it's fair to say, except for a few very, very far outlier members of Congress. And so the reconciliation process does provide a potential vehicle for the infusion of funds into this program that has major, major funding shortfalls projected. So one of the messages, and these are the messages we'd like you to communicate to members, and later in this presentation we have ways you can go about doing that. But one thing we want you to communicate is the need for the Pell Grant program to get the funds that will be necessary just to maintain the program we have. This isn't to double the Pell Grant. This isn't to increase the maximum grant. This is simply to retain the current $7,395 maximum grant. So that's point number, or reconciliation priority number one. Priority number two, workforce Pell Grant legislation. You're all familiar with this. We've been working on it for a good portion of our natural lives, or at least it feels that way on many days. But we do think, again, despite the fact that as everybody on this call, I would imagine, is aware of the obstacles we face in getting this done, there remains a huge amount of bipartisan support in both chambers and in the administration too now, with Linda McMahon likely coming in to be Education Secretary. We think that this new authority might be added to the bill. We've talked with staff about it. There's some interest in doing so. The devil will be in the details on this. We've worked very assiduously with the committees over time to make sure that those details will create a program that our colleges can access. But we think that now is a good time to just remind legislators of the importance of workforce Pell and the opportunity that they have to include this in the budget reconciliation bill. Again, I want to make sure everybody understands budget reconciliation for education primarily is about reducing spending, not increasing spending. But we think that given the fact that workforce Pell is a relatively small new program or expenditure, that this is a good chance for members to get it done. Two other things on reconciliation, risk sharing. I mentioned that just a minute ago. I'm sure most of the listeners this afternoon are familiar with risk sharing. Risk sharing remains alive and somewhat well in the Congress. The House Education and Workforce Committee, which is chaired by Representative Wahlberg from Michigan, is known to be seriously considering putting some form of risk sharing in the reconciliation bill. Likely it would be similar to one that was included in the College Cost Reduction Act from last Congress. And the bottom line on risk sharing is that it involves institutions having to pay money back for the federal government, whether it be because of the loan repayments or of their students that aren't up to some federal standards or other outcomes-related aspects of institutions. We just strongly oppose it. We've always opposed it. We think it's unfair to institutions. They don't have these resources. And the link between the penalty that is assessed and the idea that penalty would in some way create better outcomes, we think is really non-existent. We think that there's a lot of understanding of this on the Hill. It'll be interesting to see if they try to move it, whether or not they're able to. This is something that's opposed by all of higher education, not just community colleges. And but it's important for you to understand again that risk sharing is a concept that has a lot of momentum behind it and a lot of support in at least some corners of Congress. And then finally, before we talk about some general legislative issues, and I turn things over to Catherine, the tax-free Pell Grant. This is also something we've been working on for some time. And we are on the verge in both the House and the Senate and having bills dropped on a bipartisan basis by members of the tax writing committees that would make Pell Grants tax-free and would open up the American Opportunity Tax Credit to our low-income students, basically our Pell Grant recipients who essentially are kept out of that $2,500 tax credit. We've worked with many of you, I know, on this call in getting support. As I said a minute ago, it's bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate on the tax writing committees. But it's really, really important now primarily with Republican members, because again, it's going to be Republican votes that are going to be in support of this legislation. But it's important for you, especially if you have members on the Ways and Means and Finance Committee, and we can certainly help you with that. that in terms of identifying your members, if you don't know, that it's very important that they hear from you about the importance of this. This is a new tax provision. The emphasis in this reconciliation bill and the tax portion of it will be extending existing provisions. However, it's a small provision. It relates only to community colleges for all intents and purposes. We've generated a lot of support for this, so we just ask you to keep hammering away on this. We are hopeful that when a tax bill is enacted, and a tax bill will be enacted, certainly in this Congress and very likely this year, that this is included as part of it. It's not a light lift, but we think we can get it done. Next slide, we just have a couple other priorities. One is workforce Pell. I talked about that. I won't go into that again. And then the WIOA reauthorization. Some of you will know that we were close to getting that enacted at the end of the last Congress. It was actually included in a continuing resolution, and then some 11th hour dramatics over the spending bill resulted in that being deleted from the bill, which was a tremendous disappointment and setback for us. Because we were on the 1 yard line for that, for achieving that. But we understand that it was a bipartisan bill. It was negotiated by the House and the Senate. So we think there's a good opportunity for us to get that enacted sometime later this year. It would not be likely to be included in the reconciliation bill for the reasons I tried to outline a few minutes ago about the fact that it's a program that is funded through annual appropriations, and therefore it's more or less outside of the purview of a reconciliation bill. So with that, I'm going to ask Catherine to talk a bit about the College Transparency Act and a couple other issues, please.
Sure. So one thing that's, I think, outlined on this slide really well is the fact that some leadership changes in key committees could influence how a few of our longstanding legislative priorities are positioned moving forward. I think the College Transparency Act is a really great example of that. For folks who aren't familiar, the bill would create a federal student-level data network that would count both Title IV and non-Title IV students, so better reflecting the student bodies that we serve as community colleges. It would also reduce reporting burden for institutions and deliver better outcomes data for us to help inform our offerings, among other things. The longtime opponent, and in some cases the only opponent of that legislation, was Virginia Fox, who was the former chair of the Ed and Workforce Committee. She remains a member of the committee, but Chair Wahlberg is sort of an unknown quantity on this issue, and there's a real opportunity for us to do some member education on why better data would be important to him. And then Senator Cassidy, who's the new chair of the Senate Health Committee, is the champion for this issue. It's his bill. He's been the lead sponsor for several Congresses now. And I think if you asked him, he would say that this is his top higher education priority. So we're feeling pretty good about how CTA is positioned. Similar to WIOA, it's not a good candidate for reconciliation because it's primarily a policy initiative and the costs would be considered incidental and therefore not eligible. So this is something that's not an immediate advocacy need the way that many of the things mentioned for reconciliation and APROPs are, but please do be talking to your members, particularly those on committee, about why better data would be really important for serving students. Next slide. Another thing that we're watching is the Farm Bill. This is an area we've been advocating on for a few years now. The Farm Bill used to be considered a must-pass piece of legislation. It governs all USDA programs, but in recent years, things have gotten a little bit crazy and it's continued to be extended rather than reauthorized. Many of the holdups that have prevented that bill from being fully reauthorized, we expect to be dealt with in reconciliation, particularly around the costs associated with the SNAP program. So depending on how that process goes politically, there may be an opportunity to do some more bipartisan work on a Farm Bill reauthorization after reconciliation and after some of those hot topics have been dealt with through another legislative vehicle. But on our end, we have a few priorities for that bill. The main one is authorizing new grants for community college agriculture and renewable resources programs. Right now, there is very little USDA funding available to our programs, despite the fact that we know the role that we play in developing the agricultural workforce. There's been a bipartisan bill, the Community College Agricultural Advancement Act, that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate last Congress, has strong bipartisan support. was included in a number of the proposals put forward by Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, and House Republicans when they were floating their proposals for reauthorizing the Farm Bill. So we're feeling really great about how that is positioned. There's just some larger dynamics at play on if we see a full Farm Bill reauthorization. And then there's a few other things that we're looking at as well, making some technical changes to SNAP ENT to better support our students who are participating in work-based learning as an allowable activity under that program, and then streamlining access to SNAP benefits for college students where the rules are really complicated and in some cases lead to eligible students not participating and not accessing benefits that they are otherwise eligible for. So those are our priorities for the Farm Bill, and we'll keep you abreast of how those conversations go. Another thing we just want to mention quickly as we turn to the executive branch is that the president is working on staffing up his agencies with key political appointees, and just wanted to give a quick update on how that process is going for them. The first is Linda McMahon has obviously been nominated to serve as Secretary of Education. Her confirmation hearing was 2 weeks ago, and she was approved out of the Health Committee last week on a party line vote. Don't think her full confirmation vote has been scheduled yet, but we are expecting her to be confirmed. Moving in addition in the Department of Education, Nicholas Kent has been nominated to serve as Undersecretary, which is the top higher education policy role. He served in Glenn Youngkin's administration in Virginia, and before that was a lobbyist for the proprietary colleges here in DC. He will also have to be confirmed, but we haven't heard any news on scheduling his hearing or his votes yet. And then James Bergeron has been nominated to serve as Deputy Undersecretary. He's a known quantity here in DC. He's a former Hill staffer and has been very involved in higher education policy discussions. So he's a bit more of a known quantity, and we're excited to start building relationships with these folks and see where we can work together. A few other folks in the Department of Ed, Kevin O'Farrell has been nominated to serve as Assistant Secretary for Career and Technical Education, so overseeing OCTE. He was Chancellor of CTE at the Florida Department of Education. Kimberly Ritchie has also been nominated to serve as Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at Ed. She's a little bit more of a known quantity as well in DC, having served in the first Trump administration and George W. Bush administration. For the Department of Labor, Lori Chavez DeReamer has been nominated to serve as secretary. She went through, I think, a little bit of a difficult confirmation hearing last year. She got a number of questions from both Republicans and Democrats that were a little bit critical. But one of the things that was highlighted throughout her confirmation hearing was a strong support for registered apprenticeships. So I think we can expect that to be a focus of her Department of Labor if she is confirmed. It is expected that she will be reported out of committee. Senator Maggie Hassan, who's a Democrat, announced today that she was going to support reporting her out of committee. So that pretty much assures it. We'll see what happens when she comes before the full Senate. Again, there's a number of people on both sides of the aisle who have some questions for her. So that's one that's a little bit less of a sure thing, perhaps, than Linda McMahon's nomination to serve as Secretary of Education, but we're watching it closely. And then finally, Henry Mack III has been nominated to serve as Assistant Secretary for Employment and Training at the Department of Labor, and he also comes from the Florida Department of Education. We mentioned all of these names so you have a sense of how roles are being filled, how quickly they're being filled, but also because we want to start building relationships where we can. And if any of you folks know these people or have relationships with them and can help us build those connections, we really want to take advantage of those opportunities. Turn it back to David.
Thank you, Catherine. And I would add that there are a number of other individuals in the departments that are political appointees under President Trump that we've had relationships with before the second Trump administration. So we feel that we're pretty well positioned in terms of being able to have access for our positions within the Trump Departments of Education and Labor in particular. This next slide has something that everyone is aware of, that I'm not going to spend a lot of time this afternoon going into in any detail. I'm going to ask Jim to make a couple of comments about it, but we did feel the responsibility to let our members know how closely we are watching the Trump administration's actions that it's taking in relation to DEI programs on our campuses, the executive orders that have been released early in the administration, the Dear Colleague letter that was circulated to presidents on February 14th, with notice that enforcement actions would be likely to start or possibly start on the 28th of February in 2 weeks. We have no indication one way or another what will be happening. I'd just like to make maybe one comment as somebody who's worked with institutions a long time on a lot of these issues, and it relates to the core requirements that institutions must meet in order to be in compliance with law. And of course, as we always say, institutions must comply with the law. They know they must comply with the law. And as far as and they know that they must comply with the law and are making every effort to do that. And on that point, the law has not changed since the Trump administration, the second one, took office. But the comment I want to make is that over time, we have been very aware of our institutions' activities in terms of helping all students succeed. And we are also aware that the compliance with the law involves Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution. And in conversations with presidents over a long time, well before this administration and administrations back, it's become clear, at least to me, that the college's leaders are well aware of their legal responsibilities in this area and are quite sensitive to them and conscious of them. And so although the environment has no doubt changed with the issuance of the executive orders, the Dear Colleague letter, I won't go into any comments about those substantively. I would say that as somebody who's just worked with our institutions again over a long period of time, the emphasis on compliance with the relevant statutes has been something that has been top of mind of institutional leaders from my perspective. And so it's something that I just wanted to mention to you as you move forward in an effort to make sure that institutions continue to comply with all relevant laws and attendant regulations. So with that, as a general comment, I'm going to ask Jim just to talk a little bit about some of the executive orders that have been released by the administration.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think most folks are pretty familiar with the what we'll call the anti-DEI orders, and these are the two that were most important in that regard. And as you see, the Dear Colleague letter that David was just talking about was actually a product of one of them. And the key thing to keep in mind here, well, two things. One is hopefully many of you got the chance to participate in our webinar on Monday on the Dear Colleague letter. We have launched AACC on its website, has a toolkit of information specific to the Dear Colleague letter. So I encourage you to go check that out. And then the other thing to keep in mind, not only for the DEI orders, but as you'll see in the next couple of slides, is there's a tremendous amount of litigation ongoing. There will be more litigation in these and other areas, but for these two orders, we did have an injunction put forth, ordered by a court on February 21st that preliminarily enjoins some key aspects of the DEI orders, what is called the termination and certification parts of those orders. And those are two areas that deal specifically with contractors and grantees of the federal government. So the order basically ordered agencies to go through all of their, essentially go through the grants and cut anything that dealt with quote unquote illegal DEI. And then there was another one that would called on from this point forward, although this could be put into contracts and grants retroactively, a clause in contracts and grants that contractors and grantees would need to certify that they are not using any of the money in that contract or grant to support, again, quote unquote, illegal DEI. Both of those clauses are the ones that were enjoined by the court on last Friday. So a lot more to come there. And then, hold on as I try to move the slide. There we go. Moving on to a couple of other things that have happened, and I think have gotten a lot of press and probably mostly aware of. At the end of January, one of the first actions taken by the new administration was to implement a government-wide funding freeze through an OMB, Office of Management and Budget memorandum that, as you can see here, ordered agencies to pause any activities that may be implicated by President Trump's executive orders. So, again, pausing any activity that might have something to do with DEI. At the time, the administration was fairly quick to, at least the Department of Education was reasonably quick to say this doesn't affect student aid programs and so forth. Fairly quickly, the Office of Management and Budget issued another memorandum that rescinded the first one, ending that funding freeze because the court had issued a temporary restraining order. And then since then, the court has issued a preliminary injunction against that funding freeze. Nonetheless, there have been in the press, and I'm sure you've all been reading like we have, about reports of non-compliance with those court orders. And that's another potential theme that we're seeing here in terms of all this action. Another one that we just want to mention real quickly, because obviously it impacts colleges as institutions of education, and that is an executive order to rescind all federal funds from educational programs that permit transgender women to compete in women's athletics. There is litigation here as well. No orders yet, as far as I'm aware, in this particular area. However, we did see the NCAA pretty shortly after this order came out announce that they would amend their policies accordingly in terms of not allowing a transgender woman to compete on women's teams. Another thing that we get a lot of questions about, and it just came up in terms of the reports that I'm reading at the cabinet meeting that was just held by President Trump, and that is the potential elimination or diminution of the Department of Education. There have been reports now for a while that we will see an executive order in this area. We have not seen that yet. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the department can't be eradicated altogether administratively, but there are steps and there are things already underway that the administration can take to diminish the size and scope of the department nonetheless. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there are layoffs underway in the Department of Education, as there are in pretty much every other federal agency at this point in time. And then also one of the other steps that was taken was cancellation of, I believe it was 89 contracts in the area of the educational sciences. And that has created a lot of chaos for institutional researchers and others. So that's another element of what we're seeing as I mentioned a second ago, this came up again in the cabinet meeting where President Trump reiterated his desire to greatly reduce the size of the Department of Education and move a lot of its functions both to other departments and also to the states as well. And then another one that we just want to bring to your attention, this gotten a lot of attention, is a DHS directive. So this is not an executive order per se, but a change in policy on the part of the Immigration and Customs to not hold back from conducting immigration enforcement in or near sensitive areas, which include your campuses, basically. Litigation is challenging this new directive is ongoing in this area as well. Again, no injunctions to report there. So more to come in that area as well. And I'll turn it back over to David to finish this up.
Thank you, Jim. So before we take your questions, please put them in the Q&A box if you have any. Just wanted to remind everybody of what our asks of you are for our advocacy here in DC. These are the five major items that we're looking for your support. You have the link below at the bottom of the slide of ways to contact your member of Congress. The last bullet refers to something that Jim mentioned about the appropriations process, and that is that it's really important now, particularly with new members, but given the overall effort to try to reduce spending across the board, it's really important for you to remind your legislators about the value of the programs that the federal government supports. It's something that you all know. Just a little reminder there that now is especially important given, again, the movement towards restraining spending to advise people of what the programs mean on your campus. The other points are all things that we mentioned, making sure that the Pell program has sufficient resources, workforce Pell, no risk sharing, no way, no how, and then tax-free Pell Grant.
All right, folks, we got about 9 or 10 minutes. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box and we'll get right to them. The first one is a question about the mechanics of risk sharing. How does that work for community colleges? If a student defaults but attended community college and a university, does this count against both schools?
That is a good question.
That might be a stumper.
I think the answer is that it counts only against the institution that conferred the credential. So it wouldn't be the community college, but that might have to be determined through regulation, assuming we're talking about the College Cost Reduction Act form of risk sharing. So that's a good question. I don't think there's anything in there that directly address this in there being the bill. So I believe it would be again the institution that awarded the highest credential. But let's confirm that and get back to you.
Next question is about the Dear Colleague letter. We have heard that additional information referenced in the Dear Colleague letter will be released this week. Do you know if that's accurate? I don't think that we do know that at this point. We do, we know as much as you do at this point in terms of the fact that the Dear Colleague letter mentioned that there will be additional guidance forthcoming. We have not heard anything specific as to when that might be. All right, next question is, if WIOA is not reauthorized in FY25, what impact will could that have on WIOA funded grants at the state level? And the answer is basically that a lack of a reauthorization would not impact that. The fact is the bill is well overdue for being reauthorized. It came due, several years ago. So the fact that it hasn't been reauthorized doesn't affect the programs. I mean, we wanted to get reauthorized for a number of reasons, but on a year-to-year basis, at least in the case of this program, it does not have a direct impact on the Congress's ability to fund the programs, which they have been doing. So really the bigger question there in terms of WIOA programs for FY25 is on the funding side and, trying to make sure that we maintaining that funding in that area. But that is a discussion that is separate really from the reauthorization discussion. Okay. Well, here's kind of more of a thinker question. How do we choose our advocacy priorities? David, you want to field that?
That's a good question. I'd say that we work very closely with our CEO, Dr. Bumpus, in articulating association priorities. We also work very closely with our board of directors, and the board has a committee on government relations and public policy. And we work closely with that committee to ensure that the priorities that we have in association are consistent with what our campuses want us to be advocating on. Of course, a lot of the calculation behind it just comes down to dollars and cents, but there are programs whose value to the institution is greater than what it might appear just from a simple appropriations angle.
Great, thank you. Catherine, this one might be for you. How will the ask for grants in the Farm Bill impact the USDA decision to cancel grants and scholarships to HBCUs particularly since many of our institutions are minority serving tribal, HSIs, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I would also say I think that decision to suspend those dollars is a little bit of an evolving situation. So I don't know exactly what's going to happen as far as litigation. I think there is a much larger question happening right now about what Congress is going to do to ensure that the dollars that they appropriate are being used in the way that they had intended. But I think for the purpose of our ask in the Farm Bill, obviously, every administration can put forth their own sort of grant priorities when they open a grant award cycle at each agency. But the bill as written doesn't privilege any institution or any student group over any other. It is specifically focused on the type of programming offered. So you don't have to necessarily be a rural serving institution, a minority serving institution, whatever it may be. It's just you offer programming in specific agriculture and renewable resource workforce development aims. So I think that should be fine. But again, that question that you mentioned is part of a much larger conversation happening that we are also monitoring closely.
All right, got a couple more questions. One is, can we look into our crystal ball and give anything that we might be hearing about federal TRIO programs and continued funding? I'll tackle the funding part of that, and then if any of my colleagues have other comments on TRIO in particular. So the biggest thing that TRIO has going for it in terms of funding is the fact that it is a priority of Tom Cole, the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. So this has been his top or near top education priority for a number of years, and as a result, that program has done pretty well. So while we wouldn't, rest on our laurels, so to speak, that is a very good situation that particular program has in terms of its funding outcomes.
I just add that I'm sure that the questioner is aware that the TRIO lobby is a very strong lobby, extremely well organized, has had congressional champions over a long period of time. Jim's absolutely right about Representative Cole, but I would say that of the many programs that will be looked at for potential reductions as we move into the 26 cycle, if not the 25 one, TRIO probably is not one of them, given its broad-based congressional support. It's bipartisan as well.
Here's a more of a general question. How should colleges engage Republican members of Congress that may not be part of the more important committees to us during reconciliation?
That's a really good question. And I think, as always, it's important for you to communicate to your members of Congress the potential impact of changes to your campuses, to your students, that you never know, your member might have an office next to the chairman of the committee, Representative Wahlberg, if it's the House, or Senator Cassidy on the other side. And the relationships of the Congress have aspects to them that one would never know. And we feel that it's the responsibility for us and for our institutions as well to make sure that members know what these actions might mean to them. We recognize well that there are some members are much more influential than others, but we think that it's always important to transmit the potential impact of policy changes, with the idea that you never know what impact it might have. And the other part of it too, as just a general aspect of being an effective advocate, is that you want to make sure that members of Congress and their staff don't ever underestimate the importance of their staff, that they recognize you as a source of good information about the potential impact of policy changes, legislative changes, that members of Congress and their staff are, as busy as they are, really do care about students and institutions. And if you can convince them or demonstrate to them that when you talk about what these changes might mean to your campus, then they're going to come back to you with questions about how potential alterations might have a difference on your campus. So I would just say you never do wrong by communicating in a candid, straightforward, calm manner the impact of changes.
Great. Thanks, David. We'll turn now to our last question as we're just about out of time. I just want to make sure before getting to the question that everyone has seen in the chat box that Martha Parham, our communications senior vice president, has posted the links to the resources regarding the Dear Colleague letter that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So go ahead and check that out. So last question, is AACC working with regional accrediting agencies to address the impact and uh, potentially changed accreditation requirements and standards related to sunsetting DEI programmatic activities?
I do know in response to that our CEO, President Dr. Bumpus met just last week with the heads of the regional accrediting agencies. I'm not sure that this topic was discussed, but Dr. Bumpus keeps ongoing close relationships with the leaders of all the regional agencies. So as that possibility or as this comes under consideration, I know he will be in contact with them about that. And last but not least, we have our upcoming in September, our Advocates in Action, which we'll be doing here in DC for 2 days. The days of the week are different this year than previously. It's Tuesday and Wednesday. We've usually started it on a Monday or a Thursday. We hope that you find our programming of value as reflected in this webinar. We think that this meeting is a really excellent meeting. We always get very high evaluations from people who attend it. So we hope that you can put this on your calendar and make it to Washington. It's both the seminar to the extent that we provide you with access to very high-level decision makers and influential people in town, as well as an opportunity to advocate for our common cause on issues. So it's both a learning and an advocacy experience in a couple of days. With that, I think we should draw things to a close. Thanks, everybody, for being with us, and we will be back with you again in the near future. Please stay in touch. And I'd like to just thank you as well on behalf of my colleagues, Jim, Catherine, and Martha.